The street always looked softer in the early morning, before the noise and heat of the day settled in. The small houses, lined close together, seemed peaceful from a distance, almost quiet enough to make someone believe everything inside them was normal. But even before the crime, before the lies began to bleed through the walls, there was always something uneasy in the air, something people felt but never said out loud. Neighbors noticed the strange looks people exchanged, the long silences behind closed doors, and the way some truths were kept buried under forced smiles. They didn't know it yet, but the story that would soon shake the entire town had already begun a long time ago, in ways no one had ever bothered to question. The town itself wasn't rich. It was the kind of place where most families knew each other by name, where gossip spread faster than news, and where people judged more easily than they helped. It was also the kind of place where a woman raising a child alone drew attention, especially if that child didn't look like her. People pretended not to stare, but they did. They whispered behind her back, wondering why she would choose to raise another woman's baby. They said it softly, but she heard it every time. The looks weren't the usual curious kind. They carried something sharper, like disapproval mixed with a strange sort of satisfaction, as if they believed she had done something wrong. And yet, in the middle of the judgment and quiet cruelty, she kept her head down and went on with her life, as if the world around her didn't keep trying to bruise her spirit. She wasn't the first woman in town to raise a child alone, but her case felt different to people, mostly because they couldn't understand it. She was gentle and soft-spoken, always choosing silence over arguments. That alone made some people think she was hiding something. The child she raised had big, curious eyes, always watching everything around him, always holding onto her hand a little than most children would. Their bond was clear, but so was the distance people kept from them. Some women made sure to hold their children closer when they walked past. Some men watched her with suspicion, as if waiting for her to slip up and reveal the truth they were eager to believe. But beyond all the whispered opinions, stronger forces were moving quietly in the background. Forces tied to people far beyond the reach of this town, people with wealth, people with power, people who were used to getting exactly what they wanted and erasing anything that got in their way. People who lived in another world entirely, a world built on secrets and influence, where a child wasn't just a child, but an heir and a threat. Before the truth came crashing down, life pretended to be peaceful. The woman worked long hours, kept the house clean, and made sure the little boy always felt safe. She lived simply, almost too merely, as if she was afraid of drawing attention to herself. Even the way she moved felt careful, like someone who had learned the hard way that the world could turn cruel without warning. But there were moments, small ones, barely noticeable, when something in her eyes shifted. When she stared out the window at night a little too long. When she locked the front door twice instead of once. When she jumped at the sound of a car slowing down outside, even if it was just a teenager parking after curfew. Those were the moments that hinted at the story hiding beneath the surface, the real reason she never let the boy out of her sight. She wasn't just a tired mother. She was someone carrying fear around like a second skin. At the edges of this quiet life stood the other characters in this story, people who had no idea how deeply they were about to be pulled into something far more dangerous than they were prepared for. A neighbor who always pretended to be friendly but watched too closely. A man who visited the town once a month, always leaving before sunrise. And someone else, someone none of them had met yet, but whose shadow had already touched their lives without them knowing. The relationships between these people seemed normal on the surface, but each one held a sliver of tension if you looked closely enough. There were power imbalances buried under politeness, conversations that looked harmless but carried unspoken rules, people pretending to care when what they really wanted was control. These small imbalances grew slowly, quietly, until they became the cracks that would later split everything wide open. The woman raising the boy had learned to survive inside these cracks. She knew how to keep her voice steady, how to avoid attention, how to stay unnoticed. But the more the child grew, the harder it became to hide the truth, because his features were changing, his face becoming more defined, more familiar. Some people said he looked like someone they had seen on the news once, someone far too powerful to be connected to a woman like her. She always laughed it off, but her hands shook every time. In the days before everything went wrong, she moved through life the way someone walks across thin ice, carefully, trying not to break through. But even she could sense that something was shifting, that the quiet world she had built was starting to tremble. She didn't know when it would happen or how, but she could feel the danger coming closer, step by step. And the moment the truth finally arrived, it would destroy the fragile peace she had tried so hard to protect. Because the child everyone mocked, the child they whispered about, the child she fought to keep hidden. He wasn't just someone else's baby. He was the heir to a billionaire, someone whose name alone could change everything. And the people connected to him were finally coming to collect what they believed belonged to them. The trouble didn't begin all at once. It came in pieces, small, sharp, and easy to ignore if someone wasn't looking closely. But she felt each piece as it landed, each shift in mood, each new stare from the neighbors, each question asked with too much curiosity. At first, it was only whispers. A comment dropped by a woman outside the grocery shop. A man asking if the boy's father ever visited. People pretending to joke, but she could hear the real questions hiding underneath. And every time someone commented on the child's growing resemblance to a man far outside their world, the panic inside her tightened a little more. The boy had turned 5 by then. His features were changing fast, faster than she had hoped. She had prayed his face would stay soft and unrecognizable, but every month he looked more like the man she feared. His eyes, his jawline, even the way he carried himself seemed to belong to someone else. Someone powerful, someone dangerous, and people in the town started noticing things she had worked so hard to hide. The first sign came one evening when a neighbor, Mrs., stopped her outside the house. The woman wore a smile that didn't reach her eyes, a smile that always made her skin crawl. "You know," she said while pretending to admire the flowers by the fence, "I've been thinking that boy of yours has such a strong face. Reminds me of someone. Can't put my finger on it yet, but I will." She said it sweetly, but it felt like a threat. That night, the mother barely slept. She sat on the edge of the boy's bed, watching him breathe, telling herself over and over that he was safe. But something told her the world was beginning to close in. Days later, another man, the one who always lingered near the small hardware store, asked her too many personal questions. He liked pretending he cared. He liked offering help she didn't ask for, and every time she refused, the smile on his face slipped just a little, revealing a hint of anger he tried hard to hide. He started showing up more often. Sometimes he stood across the street from her house. Sometimes he pretended he was just passing by. She didn't know what he wanted, but she knew he wanted something. Then there was the monthly visitor, the quiet man who came to town early in the morning, spoke to no one, and left before the sun was fully up. He didn't look dangerous, but he moved like someone who was always watching. The first few times, she convinced herself it was a coincidence. But when she found him standing across from the school one afternoon, staring at her son, she knew it was no coincidence at all. He never spoke to her. He never even stepped close enough to make it obvious. But he watched the boy with a look she recognized instantly, the look of someone who knew exactly who he really was. The tension inside her life began to rise like steam trapped under a lid. Every day felt like a countdown, though she didn't know to what. She found herself checking the locks more often, memorizing the sound of every car that passed their street. She started picking the boy up from school earlier, afraid to let him walk even a few steps without her. Still, she kept going. She didn't have a choice. But the people around her were changing too, and not for the better. The town's gossip grew heavier. Small comments turned into louder discussions. Women in the market stared openly now, without shame. Some of them said she should stop lying about the boy's birth. Some claimed they knew the real story, even though they didn't. And the ones whispered that the child's mother had abandoned him because of something the woman had done. One afternoon, she walked into the bakery and heard 2 women whispering near the counter. "She's hiding something," one said. "No one raises another woman's baby without a reason." "Maybe she wanted attention," the other replied. "Or money, or maybe the mother left because of her. You know how these things go." They didn't know she was standing right behind them. When they noticed her, they smiled as if nothing had happened, as if their words hadn't cut her to the bone. The external pressures kept piling up. Money was tight, then she wanted anyone to know. Her job barely covered rent and food, and with the boy growing, her expenses grew too. Some nights she wondered if she would have to move again, but moving meant leaving behind the little bit of stability she'd managed to build. Moving meant risking someone noticing the boy's face in a bigger, more crowded place. So she stayed, holding on to the hope that things would calm down. They didn't. Instead, old wounds from her past started reopening. People from her previous life, people she had once trusted, began showing up in subtle ways. A letter slipped under the door with no name on it. A picture of the boy was sent anonymously to her workplace mailbox. A message scratched lightly onto her car window, "You can't hide him forever." She didn't know who sent it, but she knew why. The billionaire family had finally started looking. They had pretended he didn't exist for years. They had acted as if the child was just a rumor, a mistake, an inconvenience. But now that he was old enough to be useful to, they wanted him back. Not for love, not for compassion, but for control, power, and the image they protected more fiercely than anything else. His existence threatened everything they stood for. If the world knew the truth, it could shatter reputations, weaken alliances, and ruin the carefully built facade of perfection they lived behind. She wasn't supposed to keep the child. She wasn't supposed to run. She was supposed to hand him over quietly and disappear. But she didn't. And now they were coming. Meanwhile, the people in the town began turning their suspicion into action. One night, the hardware store man knocked on her door, claiming he just wanted to check in. His tone was too friendly, too forced. When she refused to open the door, he lingered for nearly 10 minutes, packing slowly across her yard before finally leaving. That night, she didn't sleep at all. Another day, a neighbor hinted that she might tell the authorities that the child didn't look like he belonged to her. She said it casually, but her eyes sparkled with excitement at the thought of causing trouble. The mother felt the walls closing in. Every day the town seemed to push her closer to the edge, and every night she wondered if she would wake up to someone breaking in to take her son. Her internal struggle grew heavier. She felt guilt, fear, and anger all mixed. Sometimes she blamed herself for everything. Sometimes she hated the child's biological father for putting them in this position. Other times she looked at her son and felt a surge of fierce love so strong it terrified her. She couldn't lose him. She wouldn't. If anyone tried to take him, she would fight until her last breath. Even the boy sensed something was wrong. He asked why she looked so tired. Why did she keep hugging him than before? Why does he check the window so often? Once he asked her if they were in danger. She lied and said no, but the fear in her voice told him everything. As the days passed, the tension reached a breaking point. The quiet man who'd been watching the boy became bolder. One afternoon, she saw him standing only a few feet away from the school gate. His eyes were fixed on the boy, his expression unreadable. When she grabbed her son and rushed to the car, the man didn't move. He simply watched them drive away. Her hands shook on the steering wheel the entire way home. Subplots began to surface in her life, threads she hadn't realized were connected until they tied themselves around her throat. The neighbor who pretended to be friendly had once worked for a wealthy family in the city. The hardware store man owed money to someone dangerous. The quiet man who watched her son wasn't a stranger at all. He was connected to the Billionaire's security team, though she didn't know it yet. And someone else, someone she once loved, was also involved. Someone who had betrayed her before and who was now being used again by the powerful family to track her down. Everyone had their reasons. Everyone had something to gain. The town's cruelty, the billionaire's greed, her financial struggles, her past mistakes, the child's growing resemblance to his real father, all of it twisted together until her life felt like it was being pulled apart by invisible hands. Every character in her story was changing. The neighbor's fake kindness was turning into an obsession. The hardware store man's interest was turning into a hunger for control. The quiet watcher's coldness was tightening into purpose. And she was shifting too. The fear inside her was hardening into desperation. The quiet woman who kept to herself was slowly becoming someone else. Someone sharper, someone willing to do whatever it took. Someone who was no longer afraid to break rules or cross lines. The closer the danger came, the more she felt a darker part of herself waking up, one that was ready to fight, to lie, to run, to even harm if she had to. Because the boy wasn't just her responsibility, he was her life. The sense of unease grew unbearable. Every day felt like the final day before something terrible. She could feel the storm building, pressing against the walls of their home, tightening around her throat. And then, when the town's judgment reached its highest point, when the billionaire's search drew closer, when her own fear had nowhere else to go, a single event pushed everything toward the point of no return. Something happened that none of them could take back. Something that would lead directly to the crime everyone would soon hear about. Something that would finally crack the fragile world she had fought so hard to protect. And once it happened, there would be no turning back. The night the crime happened began like any other, quiet enough to fool her into believing she still had time. The air outside was colder than usual, carrying the sharp smell of wet earth after a day of light rain. The sky looked heavy, swollen with dark clouds, and the streetlights flickered weakly as if they were struggling to stay alive. It was the kind of night that felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. She sensed trouble the moment she stepped into the house with her son. His small hand was wrapped around hers, cold from the walk home, and she could feel him trembling slightly. He had noticed the man again, the quiet watcher standing near the school fence earlier that day. He didn't say anything about it, but she saw the fear flicker in his eyes. She locked the door behind them, checked it twice out of habit, then pulled the curtains closed. The house felt too still. Even the walls seemed to be listening. She could hear her own heartbeat, fast, uneven, and she tried to steady her breathing, but the pressure inside her chest refused to ease. As she cooked dinner, her son sat at the small table, drawing with the broken crayons he loved. She kept glancing at the window, afraid of seeing a shadow outside. Her hands shook every time she touched something, but she forced herself to stay calm for the boy. She needed to think clearly. She needed to figure out what to do. But trouble had already arrived. She didn't hear the quiet watcher approach. She didn't hear the hardware store man cross the yard or the neighbor open her gate. She didn't hear the engine of the dark car parked at the end of the street, the car that didn't belong to anyone in town. She didn't realize she was surrounded until it was far too late. It began with a knock at the door, a slow, deliberate knock that wasn't asking for permission. The boy looked up, eyes wide. She froze for a moment, unsure if she should hide, run, or stand her ground. Then the knock came again, heavier this time. "Stay here," she whispered to her son. She stepped toward the door, but before she could reach it, she heard a voice she recognized instantly. "Open the door, we need to talk." It was the hardware store man. She felt her stomach twist. He wasn't alone. She could hear another set of footsteps, lighter, more controlled. And then she heard the neighbor's voice, sharp and eager. "You can't keep pretending. Everyone knows you're hiding something." Something inside her snapped. She wasn't going to let them near her son. But before she could do anything, before she could even reach for her phone, the window beside the door rattled. Someone was trying to unlock it from the outside. That was the moment she understood it wasn't just gossip anymore. It wasn't just judgment or curiosity. They were here to take him. And behind them, hidden in the shadows, the billionaire's men were watching, waiting to see how the situation would unfold. Her hands went cold. Her breath disappeared. A primal terror rose inside her, stronger than anything she had ever felt. She grabbed her son, lifted him into her arms, and rushed toward the back door. But before she could reach it, the hardware store man forced the front door open with his shoulder. The wood splintered, the lock snapped, and the door swung violently inward. The sound echoed through the house like a gunshot. The boy screamed and clung to her neck. The man stepped inside, his face twisted with anger. The neighbor followed, her expression filled with something wild, some twisted sense of victory. And behind them, the quiet watcher appeared at the doorway, silent as always, his eyes locked on the child. "Give him to us," the neighbor said. "We know he's not yours." Those words ignited something dark inside the mother. She took a step back, shielding her son with her body. "He's mine," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "You have no right." "You stole him," the neighbor snapped. "You lied to this whole town," the hardware store man added. And then the quiet watcher spoke for the first time. "He belongs to a different world." That froze her. His voice was calm, almost gentle, too gentle, a voice that didn't match the threat beneath it. And the way he looked at the boy, like he was a claim, not a child, made her fear shift into full desperation. She tried to run again, but the hardware store man reached out to grab her arm. She yanked away and stumbled, almost falling. The boy cried harder, terrified. The man lunged again, this time grabbing the boy's leg. The mother twisted her body, pulling the child back. The neighbor tried to pull the boy from her arms, shouting that she was the one trying to hurt him. It was chaos. Hands pulling, bodies clashing, furniture knocked over, the boy screaming. The mother didn't think, she reacted. She shoved the neighbor away so hard the woman fell backward, hitting the side of the cabinet and crying out. The hardware store man stepped forward again, his face red with rage. "You're crazy, just give him here." He grabbed the boy's arm. The mother grabbed him back. The child was caught in the middle, crying and kicking, terrified. And then, something snapped inside her. In the corner of the kitchen was a heavy glass vase, something she had been given years ago and never used. Without thinking, without planning, without even meaning to, she reached for it with her free hand and swung. The vase hit the hardware store man on the side of his head. The sound was sickening, dull, hollow, final. He staggered, eyes wide, blood instantly running down his face. He reached out blindly, trying to grab onto something, but his legs buckled beneath him. He fell forward, hitting the table, then the floor. The room went still. The neighbor screamed. The boy sobbed into his mother's shirt, and the quiet watcher stared at the fallen man with a cold, unreadable expression. The mother dropped the vase. It shattered at her feet. Her breath came in short bursts. Her heart hammered so violently she thought it might tear out of her chest. She hadn't meant to kill him, not even hurt him this badly. She only wanted to protect her son. But the man's body wasn't moving. Blood spread across the floor, dark and thick. She stared at him, shock twisting through her mind. I didn't mean to. I didn't mean to. I didn't mean to. But intention didn't matter anymore. What was done was done. The quiet watcher stepped closer, standing over the man's body. His expression didn't change. Instead, he looked up at her, eyes cold and knowing. You've made it worse, he said softly. Now they'll take him for sure. She felt her knees weaken. The neighbor backed away, horrified, her earlier confidence replaced with fear. You're insane, the woman whispered. You're dangerous, you shouldn't have that child. Those words shattered the last piece of calm inside her. The watcher reached into his jacket, pulling out a phone. I need to make a call, he said. They'll want to hear about this. That moment snapped her out of the haze of shock. She realized what was happening. He wasn't here to help. He wasn't here to intervene. He was here to collect evidence, to report back to the billionaire, to deliver the child into their hands. She grabbed the boy and ran toward the back door. Behind her, she heard the neighbor yelling, the quiet watcher calling after her, the sound of a body shifting on the floor. She didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Her entire world had collapsed into two simple truths. She had killed a man, and now they would come for her son. The night outside was freezing, the wind sharp as it cut against her skin. She ran barefoot across the wet grass, the boy clinging to her, sobbing into her shoulder. Behind her, voices rose, people shouting, footsteps pounding across her yard. She didn't look back. Her mind raced with panic, guilt, terror, all tangled together. She wanted to cry, scream, and collapse, but she couldn't, not now, not with her son in her arms. The chaos inside her body matched the chaos behind her house. She heard someone call her name. She heard someone else yell for help. And through it all, the sound of sirens started to grow in the distance, loud, sharp, coming fast. Someone had already called the police. She stumbled into the darkness, running without direction, without a plan, without hope. All she felt was the need to keep moving, to keep her son alive, to keep him away from the people who wanted to take him. The crime had changed everything. The world around her had shifted into something dangerous and unstoppable, and she wasn't sure where it would lead. But she knew one thing for certain. There was no going back. The chaos didn't fade after she ran into the night. It only spread. It seeped into every street and every conversation, twisting the town into something colder, something sharper. People who once whispered behind closed doors now spoke loudly with shaking voices, telling each other what they thought happened, adding details that didn't exist, turning fear into a story they could hold on to. And in the center of it all was the image of the mother running barefoot through the darkness with her child in her arms, an image that refused to leave anyone's mind. The police arrived at her house less than 10 minutes after she fled. They found the neighbor packing outside in tears, her face pale, her hands shaking. She stammered through the story, mixing truth with panic, her voice rising every time she mentioned the boy. She said the mother had snapped. She said the boy wasn't safe with her. She said she'd always known something was wrong. The words poured out faster than she could think, each sentence making her sound more like a victim than a witness who had barged into someone else's home. Inside, the hardware store man lay on the kitchen floor, unconscious, blood still pooling beneath his head. The shattered vase glittered across the tiles. The quiet watcher stood by the door, calm and controlled, already speaking to someone on his phone, answering in short, careful sentences as if choosing each word with intention. When the officers asked him what happened, he told a version of the truth that conveniently removed all mention of who he truly worked for. He didn't say anything about the billionaire. He didn't say anything about shadowing the child. He didn't say anything about being sent to observe. He simply said he happened to be passing by when he heard shouting. The officers accepted it because they had no reason to. They didn't know the reach of the man lurking behind him, the kind of man whose money could bend stories into shapes that suited him. The hardware store man was rushed to the hospital. No one knew yet if he would survive. The news of his condition spread fast, carried from house to house through anxious whispers. People who used to greet the mother with stiff nods now spoke of her with anger, fear, outrage. They said she was unstable. They said she had fooled everyone. Some said she had planned it all from the start. Not one person stopped to remember her quiet nature, her long workdays, the way she kept to herself. The crime washed all that away, leaving only the image of violence. Meanwhile, the mother and her son hid in the woods behind the town, the cold air biting through their clothes. She huddled with him beneath a cluster of old trees, trying to keep him warm, trying to calm his shaking. He kept asking if the man was dead. She couldn't answer, not because she didn't know, but because she didn't trust her voice not to break. She was drowning in a storm of guilt. Not for protecting her child, not for fighting back, but for the moment she lost control, for the sound of the vase hitting the man's skull, for the way his body fell. The memory replayed over and over, every detail sharp and unbearable. Her hands wouldn't stop trembling. Her thoughts kept circling the same questions. What had she done? What would happen to her son? Would they take him away if she surrendered? Would he end up with the very people she'd spent years protecting him from? She knew she had left the world of normal problems behind. There was no going home, no walking into the police station to explain herself. The watcher had seen everything. The neighbor had seen everything. The story was already out of her hands, twisting into something dangerous. By morning, the news had hit every corner of town. Reporters flooded the streets. Cameras were pointed at her house. Old photographs she had forgotten existed were pulled from the internet and spread across television screens. People who had never spoken to her were now discussing her like they had known her for years. Neighbors drove past slowly, staring at the police tape, talking about the child like he was some mysterious creature instead of a frightened boy. Some blamed her completely. Some blamed the town for ignoring the warning signs. Some blamed the unknown father, whatever he was, creating new rumors about why the child had appeared so suddenly in her life. And some, especially those who had always her quiet strength, took the chance to paint her as a villain. The hardware store man's family gathered outside the hospital, crying, angry, lost. His wife refused to speak to the media, her grief too raw to turn into a public show. She only said one thing: he went to help and look what happened to him. Her words spread quickly and shaped the narrative even more. The town now saw him as a hero, and as the danger he tried to protect them from. But the quiet watcher had his own reaction, one no one else knew about. He left the scene before sunrise, driving straight to the nearest airport where a private plane waited. He had one job: retrieve the child. Now that the mother had committed a violent crime witnessed by two people, his path was easier. All he needed to do was find her, take the boy, and deliver him to the family that had hired him. He felt no guilt, no hesitation. To him, the mother was not a victim, she was an obstacle. Someone who stood in the way of something important, something bigger than any of them. The Billionaire's team had already prepared a statement for the media, carefully worded, emotionally distant, denying all involvement while expressing concern for the child's safety. Their lawyers contacted local authorities, offering resources and assistance, making themselves appear charitable while keeping their true goal hidden. Back in the woods, the mother's fear intensified. She knew the search would begin soon. She could already hear distant sirens. She could see faint beams of light moving through the trees. Every sound made her flinch. Every shout in the distance made her hold her son. The boy was quiet now, too quiet. He stared at her with confused eyes, trying to understand why everyone had turned into a threat. His innocence was slipping away, replaced by fear he shouldn't have known at such a young age. The weight of that broke her heart more than anything else. "You're safe with me," she whispered, though she didn't fully believe it. As the night faded into morning, the consequences of the crime dug deeper into each person touched by it. The neighbor couldn't stop replaying the scene in her mind, guilt mixing with fear. She had wanted the truth, but now she felt responsible for pushing things too far. She tried to convince herself she wasn't to blame, but the fear in the boy's scream haunted her. The town itself carried a sense of shame under its anger. Some residents began to wonder if their constant judgment had helped fuel the mother's panic. Others blamed the growing pressure she had endured for years. But no one said these things out loud. It was easier to point fingers than admit their own cruelty. The mother spent hours trying to decide what to do. Turn herself in and lose her son forever, keep running and risk everything. She could barely think through the fog of guilt and exhaustion. Every choice felt like a punishment. But the most painful part of the aftermath wasn't the fear of arrest or the weight of what she'd done. It was the slow realization that the life she had built, the one she protected with her silence and sacrifices, was gone. The home she worked so hard to keep safe was now a crime scene. The people she tried so hard to ignore were now the ones deciding who she was. She held her son close, pressing her forehead to his, listening to his shaky breaths. She wanted to promise him a future where he would be free from all of this, where he would grow up without fear. But promises felt empty now. All she could give him was her presence and the hope that it would be enough. The search grew louder, closer. The world she had been hiding from was catching up, and she could feel the moment coming when she would have to face everything, her guilt, her fear, her past, and the powerful people who wanted to take her child. The crime had shattered more than a peaceful life. It had opened a door that could never be closed again. In the months that followed, the courtroom became the only place where all the broken pieces of this story were forced to face each other. The polished wooden floors, the quiet hallways, and the heavy air inside made everything feel slower, almost frozen, as if time itself was waiting to hear the truth. There was no more running, no more hiding behind wealth, fear, or pride. Everything that had been pushed down for years finally came spilling out piece by painful piece. When Maya walked into the courtroom the first day, people stared, not with the cruel looks she once got for raising a baby that wasn't hers, but with a strange mix of pity and respect. She had survived something most people would have never recovered from. Her shoulders were still tired, her face still held all the nights she couldn't sleep, and there were moments when her hands trembled when she thought no one was watching. But she didn't hide. She faced every whisper, every camera, every memory that tried to drag her back into the darkest night of her life. Daniel sat at the defense table, looking nothing like the powerful businessman everyone once feared. He looked smaller somehow, almost fragile, like a man carrying too many secrets on his back. His hair had lost its shine, his eyes looked empty, and every time someone mentioned the child, his jaw tightened just a little. He never cried, not in public, but anyone watching closely could see the quiet panic inside him, the regret he tried so hard to swallow. He knew he had crossed every line that mattered. Maybe he didn't mean for everything to go so far, maybe he never thought it would end in blood, but deep down, he knew his choices had pushed everything over the edge. Lily's family filled the benches on the right side of the courtroom, their faces pale and still. Her mother never spoke, just held a tissue in her shaking hands as if it were the only thing keeping her from falling apart. Her father sat stiff and silent, holding his grief like a secret he refused to show the world. They had lost a daughter to fear, obsession, and greed. They had lost her to people who let their anger grow louder than reason, louder than love. The pain in their eyes was the kind that never fully heals. The lawyers argued for days about money, motives, lies, and the long trail of decisions that had led to that single violent moment. They played messages, showed photos, and repeated every word spoken in the hours before the crime. It was painful to listen to. Every detail felt like a knife reopening wounds that were barely beginning to close. The judges and jurors listened with tight mouths, taking notes as if trying to understand how people who once shared homes, meals, and trust could destroy each other so completely. When the verdict was finally read, the room fell into a deep silence that felt heavier than any scream. Daniel was found guilty, not just for the act itself, but for the choices that piled up and shaped the tragedy. He didn't fight the decision. He simply nodded once, closed his eyes, and let out a long breath, almost like he had been waiting for this ending. Maybe strangely, this was the first moment in years where he didn't have to pretend to be someone he was. The sentence meant he would lose everything his powerful family had built, his freedom, his reputation, the empire he was meant to inherit. And yet, the biggest loss wasn't any of that. It was the child who would grow up knowing the truth. The heir to a billionaire legacy would learn someday that the people meant to protect him had destroyed each other instead. That was the wound no prison sentence could fix. For Maya, the outcome brought no real victory. She walked out of the courtroom with the child held close to her chest, but her steps were slow, unsure. Justice had been served on paper, but the emotional cost remained. She still felt the weight of everything she had endured, the insults, the fear, the nights she thought she would lose the child she loved more than her own life. She had done nothing wrong, yet she carried all the scars. Still, there was something new in her eyes now. Not joy, not relief, but a kind of quiet strength that came from surviving something meant to break her. People who had once mocked her now spoke about her like she was some kind of hero, a woman who stood strong in the face of cruelty. But Maya never cared about what they thought anymore. She had learned the hard way that the world loves to judge but rarely understands. All she cared about was giving the child a life free from fear, free from the poisonous power games that had nearly destroyed him before he could even speak. Outside the courthouse, reporters shouted questions about wealth, betrayal, and bloodlines. Cameras flashed as if the world needed to freeze every moment of this tragedy. But even with all the noise, one truth stood out above everything else. Money could protect people for years, sometimes for lifetimes, but it could not save them from the consequences of their choices. It could not buy trust. It could not rewrite what had happened in that house. The case became a symbol across the country, a reminder of what happens when pride grows louder than truth, when power is used to control instead of care, when love is twisted by jealousy and fear. People debated the laws, the ethics, and the failures that allowed the situation to get so bad. Some blamed Daniel's upbringing, others blamed society for letting wealth bend the rules. Many saw Maya as proof that courage didn't come from background or status, but from doing the right thing even when the world made you feel small. In the end, the story wasn't just about a crime. It was about how fragile relationships can be, how quickly trust can rot when mixed with secrets, and how dangerous it becomes when people try to control what they fear losing. It was about how a child, innocent, unaware, undeserving of any of it, became the center of a storm built by adults who let their darkness grow unchecked. Years later, people would still talk about the case. Some would mention the shocking crime, others would speak about the billionaire family torn apart from the inside. But those who truly understood would remember something deeper: the quiet woman who refused to give up, the small child who became the reason for truth to finally come out, and the painful reminder that even in a world ruled by money, justice sometimes finds its way through the cracks. And as Maya held the child and walked away from the courthouse that final day, she didn't know what the future would bring. She only knew that she would face it with honesty, with strength, and with a heart that had survived more than anyone had ever believed she could. She walked toward a life rebuilt from ashes, carrying the only thing that truly mattered: a child who, despite everything, still had a chance to grow up safe, loved, and free from the shadows that once threatened to swallow them both. That was the real ending, not the courtroom, not the sentence, but the quiet promise that she would never let the past repeat itself. And in that promise lived the final truth of this entire story, a reminder that in a world full of power plays and broken morals, the simplest acts of love can still fight their way to the surface, no matter how deep the darkness runs.